All right, let's dive right in. We're talking the 2024 U.S. presidential election. Harris versus Trump. But this isn't just another news roundup. We got something special lined up today, a French analysis that takes a look at things a little differently.
Yeah, it's really interesting. It goes beyond just those national polls, the ones that are showing Harris the little bit of an edge. This analysis is all about the Electoral College. And it actually suggests that Trump could be on track to win, and win big.
Wow, okay, so not just a tight race, but a potential landslide for Trump. That's a pretty big claim. It seems like every time you turn on the news, it's all about those national polls.
Yeah.
But we're focusing on the Electoral College today. I guess that's where the real action is, huh?
Absolutely, and it all boils down to those swing states. But even the idea of swing states, well, it needs a little bit of an update this time around. Take Georgia, for example. It went blue in 2020, but the latest poll showed Trump with a 5-point lead. That's a huge shift.
Yeah.
It really highlights how some states are becoming a lot more volatile.
Yeah, 5 points is a pretty big swing. So are you saying that Georgia's like the new battleground to watch? Are we moving beyond those traditional swing states?
That's what this French analysis is pointing to.
Yeah.
And it raises the question, why this shift now? One thing they point to is Trump's focus on issues like border security. It seems to be resonating with voters in these states.
Border security.
Yeah.
Interesting. Is that something that's being talked about a lot in France too? Or is this like a very American thing that maybe we don't fully appreciate from our side?
It definitely dominates the American political landscape more. This French analysis makes a good point. They say that this focus on security, well, it could be tapping into something bigger, a sense of anxiety, maybe even economic anxiety, that's actually present in both countries.
Okay, so we're seeing these shifts in the swing states and potentially a deeper kind of anxiety driving those voting patterns. What does all of this mean for Harris's campaign?
Well, you can imagine the pressures on. Her initial focus on the economy, women's rights, protecting democracy, it might not be enough to win over those undecided voters, especially in those key swing states.
It's a tough spot to be in, trying to appeal to those undecided voters without alienating your base. So what does this French analysis suggest she do?
They highlight a few things. First, Harris is really stepping up her efforts on the ground, particularly in states like Pennsylvania and Michigan, where she's currently trailing behind Trump.
So more rallies, more town halls,
Yeah.
more face-to-face with the voters.
Exactly. But it's not just about showing up. They also point out that her messaging needs to change, too. Mobilizing young voters and minorities will be key, of course. But she also needs to find a way to connect with those moderate, undecided voters, the ones who might be leaning towards Trump right now.
That sounds like a pretty tough balancing act.
Yeah.
How do you appeal to both sides without seeming inconsistent?
Well, the French analysis suggests she takes a look at how she frames those core issues, like when she talks about the economy. Maybe focus less on those big national trends, and more on how her policies will actually affect people's lives, especially in those specific swing states.
So make it personal, make it relatable.
Exactly.
Okay, so Harris needs to tailor her message, make it hit home for those swing state voters. What about Trump? What's his strategy looking like right now?
He's sticking to what he knows. Big rallies, targeted messaging,
Yeah.
a focus on those rural and white working class voters, the ones who have formed his base in the past.
And the issues, is he still hammering on those same themes? The economic anxieties, immigration?
Absolutely. He's hitting those points hard.
Yeah.
The French analysis suggests it's actually a smart move. They argue that he's tapping into a sense of nostalgia, a longing for simpler times that resonates with a certain part of the electorate.
So Make America Great Again, Part 2.
Exactly. And the French analysis argues that while it might sound simplistic, it's a powerful message, especially when people are feeling uncertain and anxious about the future.
Okay, so we've got these two very different candidates, two very different strategies,
Yeah.
and a handful of swing states that could decide it all. What does our French source say about how all of this might actually play out?
Well, this is where things get really interesting. They bring up early voting and the fact that while Democrats usually have an advantage, this year it might be different.
Wait, really? Why would that be? Don't Democrats usually do better with early voting?
They do.
Next.
This French analysis suggests we might see a surge in early voting from Republicans, maybe driven by that same sense of urgency and anxiety that Trump is tapping into.
So early voting could be a much closer race than usual.
That's what they're saying. And they also point out that there's always a chance of last-minute shifts in voter sentiment that could make things even more unpredictable.
So even though Harris has that small lead in the national polls, it's really those swing states and maybe early voting trends that we need to be watching.
Absolutely. And remember, this is all happening against the backdrop of the Electoral College, which, like we said earlier, could give Trump a big advantage. if he can keep his lead in those key states.
Okay, so Harris might be ahead nationally, but Trump could still win if he takes those key swing states.
Exactly. That's what the projections are showing. And here's the thing. If those current trends continue, Trump could end up with 302 electoral votes. That's well above the 270 he needs to win. Harris would be left with 236.
Wow, that's a big difference.
Mhm.
But of course, this is all still up in the air. We're just days away from the election. Anything could happen.
Exactly. And that's what makes this election so fascinating. It reminds us how quickly things can change in politics and how much power those swing state voters really have.
All right, so we've covered a lot in this first part of our deep dive. We've learned that the Electoral College means swing states are everything. And right now, it looks like Trump might have an edge in several of them.
We've also seen how both candidates are using totally different strategies to try and win over those voters, and that this race is far from over.
This election could genuinely go either way.
Yeah.
We've talked about shifting voter sentiment, the changing role of early voting, and potential for a really dramatic finish.
And in the next part of our deep dive, we're going to look at some historical trends and factors that might shed even more light on this incredibly close race.
So before we dive back in, here's a question for you to think about. Given what we've learned about this tight race and the importance of swing states, what do you think will be the most important factors in deciding who wins? What will ultimately tip the scales? We'll be back in just a moment to explore that further.
Welcome back. I'm really excited to dig into some of those historical parallels. You know, the ones that might help us understand this election.
Yeah, me too. It feels like we're watching this political thriller unfold in real time, these super close margins in the swing states, all the shifting voter sentiment, these two totally different campaign styles. It's like impossible to predict what's going to happen.
And that's where history comes in. This French source makes a really interesting point. To really grasp what might happen in this election, we need to look back, understand the historical context.
Okay, so let's talk history. What can we learn from past elections, especially when it comes to those nail-biter swing states? Are there any patterns that jump out from this French analysis?
One thing they really emphasize is how much swing states have changed over time. Like, you can't just assume that because a state leaned one way before, it's going to do the same thing this time around. Their political leanings can shift so much between elections, it makes predictions really tough.
Can you give us an example, like a specific swing state that's been known to be unpredictable? I'm thinking of those moments where everyone's glued to the TV, waiting for the results to come in from one particular state.
Oh, yeah. The French analysis actually uses a great example. They talk about the 1976 election and the state of Wisconsin. Before the election, most analysts thought Wisconsin would go for Gerald Ford, the incumbent Republican president. He had won the state pretty easily 4 years earlier, and the polls showed him with a comfortable lead.
So it seemed like a sure thing for Ford.
Exactly. But then, on election night, something totally unexpected happened. Jimmy Carter, the Democratic challenger, he ended up winning Wisconsin by a tiny margin, just over 1%. It was a huge upset that almost nobody saw coming, and it ended up helping Carter win the presidency.
Wow. So even when a state looks like a lock for one candidate, things can change completely.
Exactly. And the French analysis uses this example to show just how unpredictable swing states can be. They argue that even with all the data we have today, all the polling and voter analytics, those gut feelings, those local dynamics, they can still make a huge difference.
It's not just about the numbers then. It's about understanding the mood on the ground.
Exactly. And speaking of the ground game, let's talk about demographics. How have they influenced voting in swing states in the past? The French source has some interesting observations about this.
Okay, demographics. So we're talking about the racial, ethnic, socioeconomic makeup of these states. How does that all tie into their voting patterns?
Well, the analysis points out that states with large Hispanic populations, they've generally leaned Democratic in recent years, while states with big rural populations often favor Republicans.
Right. Different groups have different priorities and concerns, and that's reflected in how they vote. It's not a one-size-fits-all kind of thing.
Exactly. And the French analysis adds another layer to this. They suggest that changes in demographics within these swing states are actually making things even more complicated. Like, they point to the growing Hispanic population in states like Arizona and North Carolina.
And how might that affect the outcome of this election?
Well, if those Hispanic voters turn out in big numbers and vote overwhelmingly for Harris like they have for Democrats in the past, it could really increase her chances in those key states.
Okay, so demographics are definitely something to watch. But what about the economy? How does that play into the historical context of swing state voting?
They go really deep into
Yeah.
this, and they make a really interesting point. They say that voters in swing states are often super sensitive to economic conditions, and that this might be even more true this time around.
What makes them say that?
Well, they point to the fact that we're just coming out of this period of major economic uncertainty with the pandemic, inflation, all those global supply chain problems. They say this has created a sense of unease among voters, especially in those swing states. The ones that might be feeling the economic squeeze a bit more.
So basically, if people are doing okay financially, they're more likely to stick with what they know.
Mm.
But if times are tough, they're more open to change.
That's the historical pattern they're highlighting, yeah. And given what's happening in the economy right now, it's definitely something both campaigns are thinking about.
Okay, so demographics and the economy. Those are two big historical factors to consider. What about voter turnout? We know every vote matters, especially in those close swing states. What does the French analysis say about that?
They make a really interesting point about voter apathy. They say that while there's definitely a lot of passion and energy around this election, there's also a group of people who are feeling disillusioned with the whole political process, maybe even a little cynical.
You mean like a feeling that their vote doesn't really matter, or that both sides are basically the same?
Exactly, and
Yeah.
absolutely. The French analysis warns that this voter apathy could have a big impact on turnout, especially among younger voters and those who don't feel a strong connection to either candidate.
So both campaigns need to figure out how to get those voters excited, convince them that their vote actually does make a difference.
Absolutely. And that brings us to another important takeaway from the French analysis, the importance of local issues. They argue that even though those big national trends and hot-button topics matter, it's often those really local concerns that sway voters in those close races.
Okay, so what kind of local issues are we talking about?
Things like school funding infrastructure projects, access to healthcare, those everyday concerns that directly affect people's lives. The French analysis says that candidates who can tap into those local anxieties and offer real solutions will have a big advantage.
So it's not enough to talk about the big picture.
Yeah.
You need to show voters how your policies will make a difference in their own communities.
Exactly. And that means really understanding those local dynamics, the specific challenges and opportunities in each swing state.
So we've got demographics, the economy, voter turnout, and the importance of local issues. It seems like this French analysis is painting a pretty complex picture of how these swing states work.
It is, and I think it shows that there's no easy answer, no magic formula. For winning over these voters, it takes a deep understanding of history, knowing what economic and social anxieties people are dealing with, and a willingness to connect with voters on a personal level.
And that leads to a big question. What are the specific issues that seem to be shaping how people are feeling in those swing states? What are those hot-button topics that both campaigns are trying to figure out?
That's a great point. Let's jump right into that.
All right, so we've talked about those swing states, the ones that are always keeping us on the edge of our seats. And we've looked back at how history might give us some hints about what to expect. But this election just feels different, doesn't it? What are the issues that are really on people's minds this time around?
Well, this French analysis really zooms in on a few key areas that seem to be driving how voters are feeling, especially in those swing states that could decide the whole thing. And it's not just about those big national headlines. It's about how those issues are playing out on the ground. In those communities where every single vote matters.
Okay, so let's get into it. What's at the top of the list?
As you might guess, the economy is front and center. Concerns about inflation, job security, the rising cost of living, it's all really hitting home with voters, especially in those swing states that have been struggling economically, in recent years.
Yeah. It makes sense that those bread and butter issues would be top of mind for a lot of people.
Are there any specific economic anxieties that this French analysis picks up on?
There's one point they make that I found really interesting. They argue that it's not just about the actual economic numbers, like
Yeah.
unemployment rates or GDP growth. It's about how people feel about the economy, whether they think things are getting better or worse. And right now, there's a lot of pessimism out there.
So even if the economy is technically doing okay, if people don't feel like it's getting better in their own lives, it doesn't really matter.
That's exactly what they're saying. And they say this feeling of economic pessimism is being made worse by things like those supply chain issues we've been seeing and those rising energy prices.
It's like a perfect storm of economic anxieties.
Exactly. And they point out that this could actually benefit Trump.
Well, he's been really good at tapping into that economic unease, that feeling that things used to be better. And he's promising to bring back jobs and prosperity.
Right, he's really pushing that Make America Great Again message, and it seems to be working for some voters.
It is, and the French analysis suggests that this message might be especially powerful in those swing states that have seen their economies decline. Places that have lost manufacturing jobs or had factories closed down.
So those voters might be more open to Trump's ideas about protecting American jobs and businesses.
Exactly. And they might see Harris's focus on global trade and working with other countries as out of touch with their concerns.
Okay, so the economy is a big one. But what about some of those other social and political issues? The ones that always seem to be at the center of these elections. What does the French analysis say about those?
Well, they spend a lot of time talking about immigration, which has been a really divisive issue in American politics for a long time.
And it's an issue that Trump has really made a central part of his campaign.
Right. Absolutely. He's been very vocal about his stance on border security, appealing to voters who are worried about illegal immigration and how they think it affects jobs, crime, and national security.
And Harris, what's her position on immigration?
She's got a more moderate stance. She's calling for comprehensive immigration reform, which includes a way for undocumented immigrants to become citizens. But the French analysis points out that this could actually hurt her in those swing states where immigration is a really sensitive topic.
So she's trying to walk a fine line, trying to appeal to both sides.
She is. And the analysis suggests she might need to find a way to address those concerns about border security more directly if she wants to win over those swing state voters who are leaning towards Trump on this issue.
So it's not enough to just talk about immigration reform. She needs to show that she's taking border security seriously, too.
That's what they're saying.
Yeah.
And it's a tough balance to find.
It is. All right, so we've got the economy, immigration. What about health care? That's always a major issue in U.S. elections. What's the French take on that?
They say that healthcare is especially important in swing states with a lot of older voters and people with pre-existing conditions.
And that connects back to that economic anxiety we were talking about, right?
Yeah.
Healthcare costs can be a huge burden for families.
Exactly. And they suggest that the debate over the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, could be a deciding factor for some voters.
Meaning that people who support Obamacare might be more likely to vote for Harris, and those who want to get rid of it might be more likely to support Trump.
That's the general trend they're seeing.
Yeah, interesting. Okay. So we've got the economy, immigration, healthcare. Any other major issues the French analysis is highlighting?
Oh, yeah. They talk quite a bit about climate change. They say it might not be the #1 issue for everyone, but it's becoming more and more important, especially for younger people and those who live in areas that are already feeling the effects of climate change.
You mean like rising sea levels, extreme weather events, that kind of thing?
Exactly. And they suggest that Harris's strong stance on climate action could help her attract those voters who really care about this issue.
But could it also turn off voters in those swing states where jobs depend on fossil fuels?
That's a good point. It's another one of those balancing acts that both candidates are facing.
It seems like every issue has the potential to win over some voters and lose others. It's no wonder this election is so close.
It really shows how divided the country is and how much influence those swing state voters have.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. We've talked about how unpredictable those swing states are, those historical trends that might give us some clues, and the big issues that are shaping how people are feeling. It's clear that this election is going to be close. And with just a few days left, it really could go either way.
It's such a fascinating and unpredictable race, and this French analysis has given us a really unique perspective on what's happening.
It really has. It's been great to explore this with you. But before we wrap up, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought to consider. Given everything we've discussed, what do you think is going to be the deciding factor in this election? What's going to tip the scales?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? If I had to guess, I'd say it comes down to which candidate can really connect with those undecided voters in those key swing states. Who can convince them that they understand their worries, their hopes, their dreams for the future.
So it's not just about the policies.
Yeah.
It's about that personal connection, that feeling of trust.
I think so. In a close race like this, it's often those things you can't really measure. That sense of authenticity, that makes the difference.
And that's what makes this election so captivating, right? It reminds us that politics is all about people, understanding what drives them and connecting with them on a human level.
Absolutely. And as we head into these final days of the campaign, I think it's important to remember that no matter who wins, the story of this election, the story of this country, it's still being written.
That's a great point. And we hope that everyone listening will stay engaged, stay informed, and keep those critical thinking skills sharp. Because the future of this country is in our hands. It's up to each of us to shape it.
So as you follow this election, remember to look beyond the headlines, think about different points of view, and have those thoughtful conversations that are so important for a healthy democracy.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll be back soon with more fascinating topics to explore. Until then, stay curious.